April 7th, 1945. Kyushu Airfield, southern Japan. At 11:58 that morning, Admiral Matome Ugaki stood on the tarmac, watching the largest kamikaze operation ever assembled prepare for takeoff. 355 aircraft, every flyable plane in southern Japan, were fueled, armed, and ready to strike the American fleet off Okinawa. The pilots, some as young as 17, had already written their final letters home. The mechanics had painted cherry blossoms on the fuselages, and the ground crews had filled each aircraft with just enough fuel for a one-way trip. This was Operation Kikusui No. 1, Floating Chrysanthemums, the opening salvo of Japan's last desperate gamble to turn the tide of war through mass suicide attacks. For 10 months, since the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the kamikaze had terrorized American sailors, sinking dozens of ships and killing thousands of men. Now, with Okinawa under assault and the home islands threatened, the Japanese Navy was committing everything to this tactic. Yet by sunset on April 7th, 1945, the kamikaze would be rendered strategically obsolete. Not by American fighters or anti-aircraft guns, though those would claim most of the day's attackers, but by decisions made by Japanese admirals who transformed a weapon born of desperation into a tool of futile waste. In one afternoon, the High Command would demonstrate that even the willingness to die means nothing when tactics ignore reality and strategy becomes indistinguishable from suicide. To understand how this happened, one must look beyond the explosions and the burning ships and examine the decisions that turned Japan's most feared weapon into its final proof of strategic bankruptcy. The kamikaze did not fail because pilots lacked courage or determination. It failed because admirals ordering young men to die had lost the ability to think clearly about what those deaths could accomplish. The kamikaze was not born from ancient tradition or samurai spirit, though propaganda would later claim both. It emerged in October 1944 from cold calculation and growing desperation. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, newly assigned to command the First Air Fleet in the Philippines, faced an impossible situation. American forces were invading Leyte Gulf with overwhelming naval superiority, and Japan's conventional air power had been gutted by 2 years of attrition. Onishi's available forces consisted of fewer than 100 operational aircraft, most flown by inexperienced pilots who had received minimal training. These pilots could not execute the complex, coordinated attacks that had characterized Japanese naval aviation earlier in the war. They lacked the skill to deliver torpedoes accurately, the training to execute proper dive bombing runs, or the experience to navigate through American fighter screens and anti-aircraft fire. The mathematics were brutal. Conventional attacks by inexperienced pilots resulted in hit rates below 5%, meaning 95 of every 100 attacking aircraft would be shot down without damaging their targets. But if a pilot deliberately crashed his aircraft into a ship, loaded with bombs and fuel that would explode on impact, the hit rate could theoretically exceed 50%. One aircraft, one pilot, one ship damaged or sunk. The exchange ratio, measured in cold numbers, seemed to favor suicide attacks. On October 19, 1944, Onishi assembled his officers and presented the proposal. He called for volunteers to form special attack units, Tokubetsu Kogekitai, later shortened to Tokotai. The mission was simple: load an aircraft with explosives, fly it to the American fleet, and crash deliberately into a carrier or battleship. Success would be measured not by returning home, but by dying effectively. The response shocked even Onishi. Volunteers overwhelmed the available aircraft. Young pilots, many of whom had joined the Navy with dreams of becoming aces, now competed for the honor of dying in a single mission. Within a week, the first organized kamikaze units were formed, including the Shimpu, Divine Wind Squadron, that would give the entire tactic its eventual name. On October 25, 1944, the first organized kamikaze attack was launched against American carriers off Samar. 5 Zeros from the Shimpu Squadron, each loaded with a 250-kilogram bomb, dove into the escort carrier USS St. Lo. 4 were shot down. The 5th struck the carrier's flight deck, penetrated to the hangar bay, and exploded among armed and fueled aircraft. Secondary explosions tore through the ship. Within 30 minutes, St. Lo capsized and sank, taking 113 men with her. The tactical success was undeniable. One obsolete fighter flown by an inexperienced pilot had destroyed a carrier that would have required dozens of torpedo bombers and skilled aviators to sink using conventional methods. The exchange ratio was extraordinary. 1 aircraft and 1 life for a capital ship and over 100 enemy casualties. For the Japanese High Command, desperate for any weapon that might slow the American advance, the kamikaze seemed like a revelation. Here was a tactic that turned weakness into strength, inexperience into effectiveness, and material inferiority into a potential advantage. If Japan could not match American industrial production or pilot training programs, it could at least match American will by demonstrating a willingness to sacrifice that the enemy could not comprehend. Orders went out immediately. Expand the kamikaze program. Every airbase in the Philippines began organizing special attack units. Pilots were inducted with elaborate ceremonies, complete with ritual sake, farewell banquets, and presentations of ceremonial headbands inscribed with patriotic slogans. The symbolism was deliberate. Japan was transforming military necessity into spiritual duty, making suicide attacks not just acceptable but honorable. Yet even in these early days, the contradictions were emerging. The kamikaze worked tactically because it exploited surprise and American unfamiliarity with suicide tactics. But could it work strategically? Could crashing hundreds of aircraft into American ships actually change the course of the war? Or would it simply kill thousands of young men while delaying the inevitable? These questions were never seriously debated. The early successes, St. Lo sunk, other carriers damaged, American casualties mounting, seemed to justify the tactic. And in the desperate autumn of 1944, with the Philippines falling and American forces advancing across the Pacific, Japanese admirals had neither the time nor the inclination to question a weapon that appeared to work. The kamikaze program expanded rapidly through late 1944 and early 1945. What began as a desperate expedient in the Philippines became official doctrine for the entire Japanese Navy and Army Air Forces. Training programs were established, though training was often minimal. Some kamikaze pilots received fewer than 30 hours of flight instruction before being sent on their final missions. The organizational structure formalized around the concept of maximum sacrifice. Pilots were selected from volunteers, though the line between volunteering and being volunteered grew increasingly blurred as the war progressed. Officers would ask entire units to volunteer, making it nearly impossible for anyone to refuse without being branded a coward. The social pressure was immense, the alternatives unthinkable. Aircraft were modified specifically for kamikaze missions. Dive brakes were removed to maximize speed in the final approach. Additional armor was stripped away to reduce weight. Some aircraft had their landing gear mechanism disabled to prevent pilots from aborting missions and returning home. Fuel tanks were filled with exactly enough gasoline to reach the target area with no reserve for the return trip. The bomb loads increased as tactics evolved. Early kamikazes carried standard bombs attached externally. Later versions mounted bombs internally, with detonators wired to trigger on impact. Some aircraft, like the Yokosuka MXY-7 Oka, called Baka, Fool by Americans, were essentially piloted bombs, rocket-powered aircraft with no landing gear, no defensive armament, nothing but a 1,200-kilogram warhead and a pilot strapped into a seat with no escape mechanism. The numbers grew staggering. By April 1945, over 2,000 pilots had already died in kamikaze attacks. Thousands more were training or waiting for missions. The Japanese Navy and Army together had organized over 50 kamikaze units, each named for patriotic concepts: Divine Thunder, Heavenly Wind, 8 Cherry Blossoms, Loyal Spirit. The rhetoric escalated alongside the casualties, with propaganda claiming that kamikaze pilots embodied the highest ideals of Japanese warrior tradition. Yet the tactical effectiveness was declining. American forces, after the initial shock of suicide attacks, adapted quickly. Fighter patrols were expanded, with carriers maintaining continuous combat air patrols at multiple altitudes. Anti-aircraft defenses were enhanced with additional 40mm and 20mm guns, creating walls of fire that kamikaze pilots had to penetrate. Radar allowed earlier detection, giving fighters more time to intercept attackers before they reached the fleet. More importantly, the Americans developed doctrines specifically for countering kamikaze attacks. Ships began maneuvering more aggressively, making harder targets. Formation tactics were adjusted to concentrate defensive fire. Damage control procedures improved, allowing ships to survive hits that would have sunk them months earlier. By early 1945, the hit rate for kamikaze attacks had fallen from over 50% in October 1944 to below 20%, and still declining. The Japanese High Command noticed these trends, but responded not by rethinking the tactic, but by escalating it. If individual kamikazes were less effective, the solution was to launch more of them simultaneously, overwhelming American defenses through sheer numbers. This logic led directly to Operation Kikusui, the massive coordinated kamikaze campaigns planned for the defense of Okinawa. The rationale seemed sound. If 355 kamikaze aircraft attacked simultaneously from multiple directions, American fighters and anti-aircraft guns could not possibly stop them all. Some, perhaps many, would get through, sinking carriers, battleships, and transports, inflicting casualties that would force the Americans to reconsider their invasion plans. At minimum, the attacks would buy time for Japan to fortify the home islands. But this strategy contained a fatal flaw that would be exposed brutally on April 7, 1945. The admirals planning Operation Kikusui were thinking tactically how to damage American ships without considering the strategic question: even if the attack succeeded, what then? The planning for Operation Kikusui No. 1 began in late March 1945 as American forces landed on Okinawa. Admiral Soemu Toyota, commander of the combined fleet, ordered every available aircraft in southern Japan to be prepared for mass kamikaze operations. The goal was ambitious: launch 10 massive attacks over 2 months, each involving 300-400 aircraft, destroying enough American ships to make the invasion of Okinawa untenable. The logistics were staggering. Aircraft had to be gathered from training schools, reserve units, and even museums. Pilots were drawn from every available source: student volunteers, instructor pilots, and even men who had been grounded for injuries or poor performance. Many had never flown combat missions. Some had fewer than 50 hours of total flight time. A significant number had never landed on a carrier deck, executed a combat maneuver under fire, or even fired their guns at a real target. The aircraft themselves represented a cross-section of Japanese aviation's decline. There were modern fighters like the Mitsubishi A6M0, though most were worn-out examples with hundreds of hours on their engines. There were obsolete types like the Aichi D3A Val dive bomber and Nakajima B5N Kate torpedo bomber, aircraft that had been cutting edge at Pearl Harbor but were hopelessly outclassed by 1945. There were training aircraft pressed into combat roles, their wooden frames and minimal armor making them vulnerable to even small arms fire. Each aircraft received minimal preparation. Mechanics worked around the clock to make planes airworthy, cannibalizing parts from unflyable aircraft to keep others operational. Fuel was scarce. Japan's oil supplies had been severed by American submarines, so only enough gasoline for a one-way trip was loaded. Bombs were attached, often crudely, with some simply tied to the fuselage with rope. In several cases, the detonators were so sensitive that aircraft exploded on takeoff, killing pilots and ground crews before the mission even began. The pilots themselves underwent final preparations that mixed ceremony with fatalism. Each wrote farewell letters to family, knowing the letters would not be mailed until after their deaths. They posed for photographs in full flight gear, images that would be sent to their families as final mementos. They attended briefings where target locations were marked on maps, large American carriers if possible, any ship if necessary. And they received their final orders: fly to Okinawa, locate the American fleet, and crash into the largest ship available. The rhetoric surrounding the mission emphasized honor, duty, and sacrifice for the emperor. Officers gave speeches about how the pilots would become guardian spirits protecting Japan. Buddhist monks performed ceremonies blessing the aircraft and praying for the pilots' souls. Some pilots tied hachimaki, white headbands inscribed with patriotic slogans, around their heads, a gesture that had become iconic of kamikaze operations. The atmosphere was solemn, almost religious, transforming military suicide into spiritual transcendence. Yet beneath the ceremony lay a grimmer reality. Many pilots were terrified. Some wrote in their diaries about their fears, about wanting to live, about questioning whether their deaths would accomplish anything. Others went through the motions mechanically, numbed by the knowledge that they had been ordered to die and had no alternative. A few attempted to escape or feigned illness, though such attempts usually resulted in execution or imprisonment for cowardice. The commanders organizing Operation Kikusui were aware of the psychological toll, but considered it acceptable. The mission was not about individual pilots' feelings, but about national survival. If 355 young men had to die to sink a dozen American ships, that was a bargain worth making. If their terror and doubt interfered with their effectiveness, that was a training problem to be solved with better indoctrination. What these commanders failed to consider, what they seemed incapable of considering, was whether the mission could actually achieve its stated objectives. Even if every kamikaze hit a ship, would that stop the invasion of Okinawa? And if it could not stop the invasion, what was the point of sacrificing 355 aircraft and pilots that could never be replaced? These questions went unasked because the admirals planning Operation Kikusui were trapped in the same rigid thinking that had characterized Japanese strategy throughout the war. They believed that willpower and sacrifice could compensate for material inferiority. They assumed that American forces, confronted with mass suicide attacks, would lose their will to fight. and they convinced themselves that one massive blow could turn the tide of a war that was already lost. On the morning of April 7, 1945, none of these assumptions would survive contact with reality. The morning of April 7th dawned clear over southern Japan. Perfect flying weather for what would become the largest single-day kamikaze operation of the war. At air bases across Kyushu, pilots climbed into their cockpits as ground crews made final checks. Engines coughed to life, propellers spinning up to full speed, the sound building to a roar that echoed across the airfields. Admiral Ugaki, who had planned the operation from his headquarters, watched the takeoffs with a mixture of pride and resignation. This was Japan's answer to American material superiority, the willingness to sacrifice everything. If 355 young men had to die, at least they would die striking back at the enemy, buying time for the home islands to prepare their defenses. The first wave launched at noon. 50 aircraft, Zeros, Vals, and Kates, formed up and headed southwest toward Okinawa, 350 miles away. They flew low to avoid radar detection, skimming over the ocean at altitudes below 500 feet. The formation was loose, undisciplined. Many pilots lacked the training to maintain tight tactical spacing, and the mixed aircraft types made coordinated flight nearly impossible. The second wave launched 30 minutes later. Another 80 aircraft, including some of the Oka rocket-powered bombs carried beneath twin-engine bombers. These were the most dangerous kamikaze weapons. Once released, the Oka pilot would ignite the rocket motors and accelerate to over 600 miles per hour, making interception nearly impossible. But the carrier bombers were slow and vulnerable, requiring fighter escort to reach their release points. The third and fourth waves followed at intervals, launching throughout the early afternoon. By 2:00 p.m., 355 aircraft were airborne and heading toward the American fleet off Okinawa. It was the largest kamikaze strike ever attempted, a mass of aircraft that Japanese commanders believed would overwhelm any defense the Americans could mount. But the Americans were waiting. Radar stations on Okinawa had detected the first wave while it was still over Kyushu, more than 300 miles away. The detection gave fleet commanders over an hour to prepare, an eternity in modern warfare. Carriers immediately launched fighters, sending over 400 Hellcats and Corsairs to intercept the incoming kamikazes at maximum range. Additional fighters established defensive screens at multiple altitudes, creating layered defenses that attackers would have to penetrate. The first interceptions occurred 90 miles from the fleet. American fighters, guided by radar controllers aboard ships, dove into the kamikaze formations with devastating effect. The Japanese pilots, many with minimal combat training, broke formation and scattered. Some attempted to dogfight, a futile gesture given their opponents' superior training and aircraft performance. Most simply tried to evade, hoping to reach the fleet before being shot down. The massacre began immediately. Hellcats and Corsairs tore through the kamikaze formations, their 50-caliber machine guns shredding the Japanese aircraft. Many kamikazes exploded in mid-air as ammunition and fuel tanks ignited. Others spiraled into the ocean, trailing smoke and flame. The few pilots who managed to evade the first interception found themselves facing second and third waves of fighters, each more aggressive than the last. By the time the kamikaze survivors reached the outer defensive screen, 50 miles from the main fleet, fewer than half remained airborne. And now they faced the anti-aircraft guns. Hundreds of 5-inch guns on destroyers and cruisers, thousands of 40mm and 20mm weapons on every ship, creating a curtain of fire so dense that pilots described it as a solid wall. Ships maneuvered violently. throwing up wakes and making themselves harder targets. The coordination was remarkable, practiced over months of combat against earlier kamikaze attacks. The kamikazes pressed on, flying through the fire, accepting losses that would have broken any conventional airstrike. Some made it through to the carriers and battleships at the center of the formation. A zero dove toward the carrier USS Hancock, only to be destroyed by concentrated fire from escorting destroyers. A Val attempted to crash into the battleship USS Maryland, but the pilot was killed by anti-aircraft fire seconds before impact. The pilotless aircraft splashed into the ocean 50 yards from the ship. A handful succeeded. The destroyer USS Bush took 2 kamikaze hits within minutes, the explosions tearing open her hull and starting uncontrollable fires. She would sink within the hour. The destroyer USS Colhoun was hit by a single kamikaze that penetrated her bridge, killing most of the command crew. The destroyer Howarth took a kamikaze strike that killed 15 sailors but failed to sink the ship. A few other vessels, destroyer escorts, landing ships, patrol craft, were damaged by crashing aircraft or near misses. But the carriers and battleships, the primary targets, remained untouched. Not a single capital ship was hit during Operation Kyushu No. 1. The kamikazes had been launched with the specific goal of sinking carriers and forcing the American fleet to withdraw. Instead, they managed to sink 2 destroyers and damage a handful of smaller vessels, losses the Americans could absorb without even pausing their operations on Okinawa. By sunset, the attack was over. Of the 355 aircraft launched, only a tiny fraction had struck their targets. American fighters had shot down over 200 kamikaze aircraft. Anti-aircraft fire had destroyed another 100. A few ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean before reaching the fleet. Perhaps 24 aborted their missions due to mechanical failures or, though this was never officially acknowledged, loss of nerve. The exchange ratio, the cold mathematics that had justified the kamikaze in the first place, had collapsed completely. Japan had sacrificed 355 aircraft and 355 pilots to sink 2 destroyers. In conventional terms, this was a catastrophic failure. But for the Japanese High Command, trapped in their own rhetoric about sacrifice and spiritual strength, the failure was interpreted differently. The problem was not the tactic itself, but the scale. The solution was to launch even more kamikazes. This thinking, this inability to recognize that the fundamental strategy was flawed, would characterize Japanese naval operations for the rest of the war. Over the following weeks, 9 more Kyushu operations would be launched, each involving hundreds of aircraft, each resulting in thousands of deaths, and none changing the strategic reality that Japan was losing the war. The kamikaze, which had seemed like a brilliant tactical innovation in October 1944, had become strategically obsolete by April 7, 1945. But the admirals ordering young men to die could not or would not see it. The aftermath of April 7th revealed the full scope of the disaster. At air bases across southern Japan, ground crews waited for aircraft that would never return. Commanders compiled casualty lists that included the entire roster of pilots who had launched that morning. Mechanics salvaged parts from crashed aircraft that had exploded on takeoff or returned with mechanical failures. And the families of 355 young men received telegrams informing them that their sons had died honorably serving the emperor. The Japanese High Command's response was to immediately begin planning Kyushu No. 2. Admiral Toyota issued orders to gather more aircraft, recruit more pilots, and prepare for another mass attack. The operational analysis of Kyushu 1 focused not on whether the tactic was working, but on how to make it work better. More fighters to escort the kamikazes, better coordination to overwhelm American defenses, improved training to help pilots evade interception, larger formations to ensure some aircraft got through. What the analysis did not include, what could not be included within the institutional framework of the Japanese Navy in 1945, was the fundamental question. Was the kamikaze tactic still strategically viable? Even if future operations achieved better hit rates, could suicide attacks actually change the outcome of the war? And if they could not, what was the justification for continuing to send young men to die in missions that accomplished nothing? These questions were not merely tactical, but philosophical. The kamikaze represented a profound admission that Japan could not win through conventional means. It was a weapon born of desperation, effective only because it exploited temporary American unfamiliarity with suicide tactics. Once the Americans adapted, which they had by April 1945, the kamikaze became simply a wasteful way to kill Japanese pilots who could never be replaced. The economic calculations were brutal. Each kamikaze pilot represented years of training investment, even if that training was minimal by 1945 standards. Each aircraft represented scarce resources, aluminum, engines, aviation fuel, that Japan could not replace. Every kamikaze mission consumed materials that could have been used for defensive operations, protecting the home islands. And for what? To sink a few destroyers and damage some landing craft while the main American fleet continued operations uninterrupted? The strategic absurdity became clearer with each passing week. Between April 7th and June 22nd, 1945, Japan launched 9 more Kyushu operations, involving over 1,800 additional kamikaze sorties. These attacks sank 36 American ships and damaged hundreds more, inflicting over 10,000 casualties on American sailors. By any conventional measure, this represented a significant tactical achievement. More American ships sunk than at Pearl Harbor, more casualties than many major battles earlier in the war. But strategically, the kamikaze attacks accomplished nothing. Okinawa fell on June 22nd, despite the mass suicide missions. American forces continued advancing on schedule. The invasion of the home islands proceeded with planning unaffected by kamikaze losses. The Americans, rather than losing their will to fight, became more determined to end the war quickly and permanently. If anything, the kamikaze attacks strengthened American resolve to demand unconditional surrender and to consider any means necessary, including atomic weapons, to avoid a costly invasion where every defender might become a suicide attacker. This was the central paradox of the kamikaze. It was tactically innovative, but strategically bankrupt. It could sink ships, but not change the course of war. It could kill American sailors, but not force the United States to negotiate a settlement. It demonstrated Japanese determination, but in a way that convinced Americans that Japan would never surrender unless completely destroyed. The kamikaze, intended as a weapon to force a negotiated peace, instead guaranteed that the war would end only with total Japanese defeat. The admirals who continued ordering kamikaze operations after April 7th, 1945, understood this at some level. They knew the war was lost. They knew that suicide attacks could not stop the American advance. But they continued anyway, trapped by a logic that equated resistance with honor and surrender with shame. If Japan was going to lose the war, better to lose it while fighting desperately than to surrender while forces remained. The kamikaze became not a tool of military strategy, but a gesture of defiance. Expensive theater performed with the lives of young men who deserved better leadership. Admiral Ugaki, who had organized Kikusui 1, would eventually join his pilots in death. On August 15, 1945, the day Japan announced its surrender, Ugaki climbed into a bomber and flew toward Okinawa on his own kamikaze mission. His aircraft was never found, presumably shot down or crashed into the ocean. Whether this was an act of honor or futility depends on one's perspective, but it was certainly consistent with the thinking that had made the kamikaze obsolete. The belief that death in battle was inherently meaningful, regardless of whether it accomplished any military objective. The human cost of this thinking was staggering. Over 3,800 kamikaze pilots died during the war. Many were teenagers, some as young as 17, with minimal flight training and no real understanding of why they had been ordered to die. They left behind parents, siblings, sweethearts, and children who would grow up without fathers. Their deaths accomplished nothing that could not have been accomplished through conventional tactics with better survival rates. They were sacrificed not because their deaths would change the war's outcome, but because their commanders could not imagine any alternative. The kamikaze's obsolescence on April 7, 1945, was not technological but conceptual. The tactic failed not because American defenses were impenetrable, but because Japanese strategy had become divorced from reality. Admirals ordered mass suicide attacks without coherent objectives beyond resist and buy time. They sacrificed thousands of pilots without any plan for what those sacrifices might achieve. They transformed military necessity into spiritual ritual, making it impossible to evaluate whether the tactic was actually working. This failure of strategic thinking extended beyond the kamikaze itself. The entire final year of the Pacific War was characterized by Japanese operations that achieved tactical results without strategic purpose. Defenders fought to the death on island after island, inflicting heavy casualties on American forces, but never preventing their ultimate advance. Submarines conducted individual attacks against American shipping, but could not disrupt the supply lines sustaining the offensive. And the kamikaze sank American ships while the fleet grew stronger through replacement production that Japan could never match. The lesson of April 7, 1945 is ultimately about the danger of tactics divorced from strategy, of operations conducted for their own sake without consideration of whether they serve larger objectives. The kamikaze pilots who died that day were brave, determined, and committed to their mission. But their bravery was wasted by commanders who had lost the ability to think strategically, who confused resistance with effectiveness, and who believed that willingness to die could substitute for a viable plan to win, or at least to achieve favorable terms for ending the war. In the decades after 1945, the kamikaze became mythologized in various ways. In Japan, they were remembered as tragic heroes, young men who sacrificed everything for their country. In America, they became symbols of fanaticism, evidence of an enemy culture that valued death over life. Both interpretations miss the essential truth. The kamikaze were victims of strategic bankruptcy, young men sent to die by commanders who had run out of ideas and could offer nothing but elaborate suicide as a substitute for effective military planning. The carrier Akagi was made obsolete in one afternoon at Midway because of rigid doctrine and inability to adapt. The kamikaze was made obsolete in one afternoon at Okinawa for the same reasons, not because the tactic itself was inherently worthless, but because it was employed by commanders who could not or would not think strategically about what it could realistically achieve. Both failures shared a common characteristic: Japanese admirals trapped by their own assumptions, unable to question doctrine even when evidence suggested it was failing, sacrificing men and machines in operations that accomplished nothing except to prove that determination alone cannot win wars when strategy has collapsed into empty gesture. The kamikaze did not become obsolete because American defenses were perfect. They were not. It became obsolete because Japanese admirals, on April 7, 1945, demonstrated that they were willing to sacrifice thousands of lives without any coherent plan for how those deaths would advance Japanese strategic interests. And once that became clear, once the Americans realized that kamikaze attacks were not part of a larger strategy, but simply mass suicide without purpose, the psychological impact evaporated. What had been terrifying became merely tragic. What had seemed like fanatical determination revealed itself as strategic exhaustion. And what had been intended as Japan's ultimate weapon became proof that the war was already lost, with Japanese leadership unable to recognize or acknowledge that fundamental reality. In one afternoon, the illusion died. Only the killing continued, pointless and futile, until August finally brought the end that should have come months earlier. The institutional dynamics that made April 7, 1945 possible had been building since the earliest days of the kamikaze program. When Vice Admiral Onishi first proposed special attack units in October 1944, there was, at least, a veneer of tactical logic. Japan faced immediate crisis in the Philippines with inadequate conventional forces. The kamikaze offered a force multiplier that could theoretically compensate for material and training deficiencies. The decision to employ suicide tactics, while extreme, was presented as a temporary expedient, a desperate measure for desperate times. But the transition from temporary expedient to permanent doctrine happened with alarming speed. Within weeks of the first kamikaze attacks, the tactic had been institutionalized throughout the Japanese military establishment. Training programs were established to produce kamikaze pilots at scale. Aircraft production priorities shifted to emphasize simple, expendable designs suitable for suicide missions. And perhaps most critically, the psychological and cultural apparatus of the military bureaucracy adapted to normalize mass suicide as routine operational planning. This normalization required overcoming deep-seated taboos. Traditional Japanese military doctrine, despite later propaganda to the contrary, had not historically emphasized suicide. Samurai codes valued effectiveness and victory, not death for its own sake. The warrior ideal was to kill enemies and survive to fight again, not to throw one's life away in futile gestures. Even in earlier Pacific battles where Japanese forces had fought to the death, this was understood as last-ditch resistance when defeat was inevitable, not as a planned operational concept. The kamikaze represented something new, premeditated suicide as primary tactic rather than last resort. This required extensive indoctrination to make it acceptable to pilots, commanders, and the broader military culture. The propaganda machinery went into overdrive, manufacturing a historical tradition that largely did not exist. Cherry blossoms became symbols of kamikaze nobility, beautiful flowers that fall at the peak of their beauty, just as young pilots would die at the peak of their youth. The divine wind metaphor was deployed endlessly, referencing the typhoons that destroyed Mongol invasion fleets in the 13th century, as if weather and deliberate suicide were comparable phenomena. This manufactured tradition served a critical function. It made questioning the kamikaze tantamount to questioning Japanese identity itself. An officer who expressed doubts about suicide tactics could be accused of lacking the warrior spirit, of being corrupted by Western individualism, of betraying the emperor. The institutional pressure to conform was overwhelming. creating an environment where strategic questioning became effectively impossible. Admiral Toyota, who ordered the Kikusui operations, exemplified this dynamic. He was not a fanatic or a fool. His earlier career demonstrated competence in conventional naval operations. But by 1945, he was trapped in a system where the only acceptable response to defeat was escalation. When Kikusui 1 failed to achieve its objectives, the logical response would have been to reconsider whether mass kamikaze operations were strategically sound. Instead, Toyota ordered Kikusui 2, 3, 4, and so on, each operation larger than the last, each consuming more aircraft and pilots, none changing the fundamental strategic picture. This pattern, escalating commitment to failing tactics, is not unique to Japan in 1945. It appears throughout military history whenever institutional structures prevent honest assessment of whether current approaches are working. The difference with the kamikaze was the human cost of this bureaucratic inertia. Every day that Japanese commanders failed to recognize the strategic obsolescence of suicide attacks, another dozen or 100 young men died in missions that accomplished nothing. The pilots themselves were aware of this, at least in some cases. Diaries recovered after the war reveal profound ambivalence among many kamikaze pilots. They wrote about their fear, their desire to live, their doubts about whether their deaths would accomplish anything meaningful. But they also wrote about feeling trapped, unable to express these doubts openly without being branded cowards, unable to refuse missions without bringing shame to their families. One pilot, a 19-year-old student named Ichizo Hayashi, wrote in his final letter, "I do not know if my death will help Japan. I do not think it will. But I cannot refuse without dishonoring my parents. So I will fly tomorrow and try to hit something important, and perhaps my death will mean something after all." Hayashi's aircraft was shot down by American fighters 90 miles from the fleet. He never reached a ship. His death meant nothing strategically, but it broke his parents' hearts and deprived Japan of a young man who might have contributed to rebuilding the country after the war. Multiply Hayashi's story by thousands, and the true cost of April 7, 1945, becomes clear. The kamikaze was not made obsolete by American technological superiority or tactical brilliance, though both contributed to its diminishing effectiveness. It was made obsolete by Japanese admirals who could not admit that the strategy had failed, who continued ordering young men to die long after it became clear that those deaths accomplished nothing, who valued the appearance of resistance over the substance of strategic thinking. The American response to Kikusui 1 revealed how thoroughly the kamikaze had lost its psychological edge by April 1945. In the immediate aftermath of the attacks, American commanders conducted standard after-action reviews. They noted which defensive tactics had worked, which needed improvement, and how to better coordinate fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The tone was professional, analytical, almost routine. These were problems to be solved through technical means, not existential threats requiring fundamental strategy changes. Contrast this with American reactions to the first kamikaze attacks in October 1944. Those early suicide missions had genuinely shocked American forces. Sailors and Marines could not comprehend why pilots would deliberately crash into ships when they had the option to drop bombs and attempt to survive. The psychological impact was significant, creating fear and uncertainty about how to defend against attackers who valued dying more than surviving. But by April 1945, this psychological advantage had completely evaporated. American forces had seen hundreds of kamikaze attacks. They had developed effective countermeasures. They understood the tactics and limitations. The shock had worn off, replaced by grim determination and, increasingly, contempt for Japanese leadership that would waste lives so casually. American sailors still feared kamikaze attacks. Being struck by a suicide plane was no less deadly in April than in October. But the fear was tactical rather than existential. It was fear of a dangerous weapon, not fear of an unstoppable force. This shift was captured in American combat reports and personal letters. In late 1944, sailors wrote home about the terror of facing an enemy willing to die. By April 1945, they wrote about the tragedy of watching young Japanese pilots, some appearing to be teenagers, fly to certain death in attacks that rarely succeeded. The psychological impact had reversed. Rather than terrorizing Americans, the kamikaze convinced them that Japan was beaten and that the war needed to end quickly before more young men on both sides were killed for no strategic purpose. The operational reports from Task Force 58, the fast carrier force operating off Okinawa, illustrate this evolution. After Kyushu 1, the task force commander's report noted, "Enemy employed mass suicide tactics consistent with previous operations. Defensive measures proved effective. Air Group destroyed estimated 200-plus attackers with minimal friendly losses. Recommend continued aggressive fighter patrols and improved radar coverage. No changes to operational schedule required." The last sentence was damning. The largest kamikaze operation ever launched had not forced the Americans to delay operations by even a single day. Kyushu 1 had cost Japan 355 aircraft and pilots. In exchange, it had sunk 2 destroyers that were replaced within weeks and had not disrupted American operations at all. The exchange ratio that had seemed favorable in October 1944 had collapsed to the point where the kamikaze was simply an expensive way for Japan to kill its own pilots. Yet the Japanese High Command continued. Kyushu 2 launched on April 12, involving 185 kamikaze aircraft. Results were similar. Most shot down, a few ships damaged, no strategic impact. Kyushu 3, on April 16, 165 aircraft, same pattern. Kyushu 4 on April 22, 115 aircraft, same outcome. And so on through May and into June, each operation consuming irreplaceable resources, each failing to achieve strategic objectives, each ordered by admirals who could not or would not recognize that the tactic had become obsolete. The intellectual failure was comprehensive. Japanese commanders had lost the ability to distinguish between tactical results and strategic outcomes. They counted ships damaged as successes, without asking whether those damages changed American operational capabilities. They celebrated pilots who died in attacks without evaluating whether those deaths advanced Japanese strategic interests. They equated activity with effectiveness, resistance with accomplishment, and sacrifice with achievement. This confusion extended to how the kamikaze program was resourced and managed. By April 1945, Japan was desperately short of everything: fuel, ammunition, spare parts, trained mechanics, experienced pilots. Yet resources continued flowing to kamikaze operations, despite their strategic futility. Aircraft that could have been used for air defense of the home islands were instead expended on one-way missions to Okinawa. Fuel that could have supported training for defensive operations was burned on kamikaze attacks that achieved nothing. Pilots who could have been training to defend Japan were sent to die in attacks that did not even delay the American advance. The opportunity cost was staggering. Japan's final defensive strategy for the home islands relied heavily on air power to attack invasion forces. But by the time American forces were ready to invade, Japan's air forces had been decimated by months of kamikaze operations. The pilots who should have been defending Tokyo and Osaka were already dead, crashed into American destroyers off Okinawa. The aircraft that should have been held in reserve for home defense had been expended in futile attacks that sank a few ships while the American fleet continued growing stronger. This strategic myopia was not inevitable. There were Japanese officers who recognized the problem and tried to raise concerns. Some argued for conserving air strength for final defense of the home islands. Others suggested that conventional attacks with higher survival rates might be more sustainable long-term than suicide missions. A few even dared to suggest that the kamikaze had become counterproductive, wasting resources and convincing Americans that Japan would fight irrationally to the end. These dissenting voices were systematically suppressed. Officers who questioned kamikaze doctrine were reassigned to administrative positions or remote postings. Written memoranda raising strategic concerns were ignored or destroyed. The institutional culture of the Japanese military in 1945 had become so committed to the kamikaze that questioning it was treated as defeatism or treason. The echo chamber was complete. Commanders ordered kamikaze attacks because that was the doctrine, and the doctrine continued because commanders kept ordering kamikaze attacks. Admiral Onishi, who had pioneered the tactic, eventually recognized its futility. In his final writings, before committing suicide after Japan's surrender, he acknowledged that the kamikaze had failed strategically while succeeding only in killing thousands of young men. But this recognition came too late. After the damage was done, after the lives were lost, after the strategic bankruptcy of the approach had become undeniable even to its architects. The contrast with American strategic evolution during the same period is instructive. When American tactics proved ineffective, they were modified or abandoned. When submarine doctrine proved inadequate early in the war, it was revised based on operational experience. When carrier tactics needed updating after early battles, doctrine changed to incorporate lessons learned. The American military system, despite its own flaws and rigidities, maintained mechanisms for strategic reassessment that the Japanese system had lost by 1945. This difference was not primarily about national character or cultural values. It was about institutional structures that either permitted or suppressed honest evaluation of whether current approaches were working. The American system, for all its problems, maintained some space for questioning doctrine and revising strategy based on evidence. The Japanese system, by 1945, had eliminated that space entirely, creating an environment where failed tactics continued simply because stopping them would require admitting error. The human dimension of this institutional failure is captured in the individual stories of kamikaze pilots who died on April 7, 1945, and in the weeks that followed. These were not mindless fanatics or willing sacrifices. They were young men, many drafted or pressured into volunteering, who died because their commanders could not think of anything better to do with them than crash them into enemy ships. Consider Lieutenant Takeshi Kosai, a 21-year-old pilot from Tokyo who flew in Kikusui-1. Kosai had wanted to be an engineer, studying mechanical design at university before being drafted into the Navy. His diary, recovered after the war, shows a thoughtful young man who loved mathematics, missed his family, and wrote poetry in his spare time. His final entry, written the night before his kamikaze mission, reads, "Tomorrow I fly to Okinawa. I do not expect to return. I have tried to be brave, to accept this honorably, but I am afraid. I do not want to die. I think my death will accomplish nothing, but I will go anyway, because I must. Perhaps I am wrong, and my sacrifice will mean something. I hope so. I want my death to have meant something. Kosai's aircraft was shot down by Hellcats 70 miles from the American fleet. He never reached a ship. His death meant nothing strategically. But for his parents, who received a telegram informing them their son had died honorably serving the emperor, the meaning was profound and permanent. They lost their only child to a tactic that had already proven strategically bankrupt, ordered by commanders who continued using it simply because they could not imagine an alternative. Multiply this story by 355 for April 7th alone, then by thousands for the entire Okinawa campaign, and the scale of the waste becomes clear. These were not military casualties in service of strategy. They were bureaucratic sacrifices to institutional inertia. Young men killed because their commanders had run out of ideas and substituted elaborate ritual for actual strategic thinking. The final irony of the kamikaze is that it achieved the opposite of its intended effect. Rather than convincing Americans to negotiate a settlement, it convinced them that Japan would never surrender unless forced to do so completely. Rather than demonstrating Japanese strength, it demonstrated strategic exhaustion. Rather than terrorizing American forces, it ultimately generated a mixture of pity and contempt for leadership that would throw away lives so casually. When President Truman decided to use atomic weapons against Japan, the kamikaze attacks factored into his calculations. If the Japanese were willing to organize mass suicide attacks of pilots, what would an invasion of the home islands look like? Would every civilian become a suicide attacker? The kamikaze, intended to force negotiations, instead helped justify the weapons that would end the war by demonstrating Japanese determination to fight irrationally to the end. This was the ultimate failure of April 7, 1945. Not that Kyushu 1 failed tactically, though it did. Not that it wasted irreplaceable resources, though it did. But that it confirmed American assumptions in ways that made negotiated settlement impossible and ensured the war would end only with Japan's complete destruction. The admirals who planned Operation Kyushu believed they were demonstrating Japanese fighting spirit. What they demonstrated was strategic bankruptcy. They made the kamikaze obsolete not because Americans had perfect defenses, but because they proved Japanese strategy had.